Some disasters roar into history, others creep in silence and kill before anyone even realizes what's happening. A single plutonium sphere killed 2 brilliant scientists in agony. A quiet African lake unleashed an invisible gas cloud that suffocated entire villages. And in London, the air itself turned to poison, killing thousands in just 5 days. These are not legends. They are real scientific accidents that forever changed how we see nature, technology, and ourselves. Lake Nyos, the silent killer. Lake Nyos in Cameroon looked peaceful, a perfect volcanic lake surrounded by green hills. But on August 21, 1986, it became one of the strangest natural disasters in recorded history. Deep beneath the lake's calm surface, carbon dioxide gas had been building up for decades. Trapped under intense pressure, it waited for one small trigger. A landslide, a tremor, maybe even a change in water temperature. Then, suddenly it happened. In a single instant, the deep waters erupted. A massive invisible cloud of coal burst upward, raced across the lake, and spilled over its edges like a toxic wave. Because the gas is heavier than air, it flowed downhill invisibly into nearby villages. Within minutes, 700 people were dead. Entire families died mid-step, as if time itself had stopped. Cattle, birds, and wildlife collapsed in the fields. Even insects were gone. There was no fire, no flood, no warning, only silence. When rescuers arrived the next morning, the scene was surreal. People and animals frozen where they stood, as though they had fallen asleep. Scientists later called it a limnic eruption, a rare natural event where lakes suddenly release trapped gases with explosive force. To prevent another silent apocalypse, engineers installed degassing tubes that vent salve from deep underwater. Since then, they've identified other dangerous lakes in Africa and Asia and installed similar systems. Lake Nyos was a grim reminder that the world's deadliest forces aren't always loud or visible. Sometimes death moves quietly and breathes. The demon core death in the Lud in 1945, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a third atomic bomb core sat unused at Los Alamos. A 14-pound sphere of plutonium small enough to hold, powerful enough to annihilate a city. It was nicknamed the Demon Core. On August 21, 1945, a young physicist named Harry Daghlian worked alone, performing an experiment that had already been deemed dangerous. He was stacking tungsten carbide bricks around the plutonium, materials that reflected neutrons back into the core, pushing it closer to a nuclear chain reaction. One brick slipped, it fell onto the core, and the room erupted in a flash of blue light and heat. Harry reacted instantly, knocking the brick away. But it was too late. In seconds, he'd received a lethal dose of radiation. Over the next 25 days, his body fell apart from the inside. His hand blistered and blackened. His internal organs failed one by one. He slipped into a coma and died, the first victim of the Demon Core. 9 months later, scientists were still using the same sphere. They called their tests "tickling the dragon's tail." They knew the danger, they just couldn't resist it. On May 21, 1946, another physicist, Louis Slotin, gathered 7 colleagues for a live demonstration. He used 2 beryllium half-spheres, manually separating them with nothing but a screwdriver. If the tool slipped and the shells closed around the plutonium, the reaction would go critical. And then it did. The screwdriver slipped, the spheres snapped shut. A brilliant blue flash filled the room. Slotin didn't freeze. He reacted instantly, ripping the spheres apart with his bare hands, saving everyone else in the room, but condemning himself. He knew immediately what had happened. He calmly instructed each scientist to mark their position, calculating even in agony who would live and who would die. 9 days later, he was gone. After that, Los Alamos finally melted down the Demon Core. 2 scientists dead, 1 glowing sphere of plutonium, retired forever. The Great Smog of London, the city that choked in the winter of December 1952. London, the world's largest and most powerful city at the time, became a tomb of its own making. The familiar gray fog that rolled through the streets turned darker, thicker, heavier. At first, people barely noticed. Londoners had lived with fog for generations, even given it a name, supers, thick with soot and coal smoke. But this one was different. It began on December 5th, when an unusual cold front settled over the Thames Valley. The air was completely still. Normally, the city's smoke from coal fires would rise and disperse into the atmosphere. But a temperature inversion trapped it close to the ground. The result was a suffocating blanket of soot, tar, and sulfur dioxide, a toxic soup mixed with the city's endless furnace exhaust. Within hours, London was swallowed by a yellow, gray fog so dense that people couldn't see their own hands. Traffic stopped. Buses broke down mid-route. Theaters closed because audiences couldn't see the stage. The darkness wasn't just visual, it was physical. Soot settled into lungs, into homes, onto food. At first, Londoners treated it like an inconvenience. They walked to work with scarves over their mouths. They joked about another bad fog. But by the second day, the coughing began. The fog grew thicker, carrying a sharp, metallic taste. The air stung the eyes. Hospitals began filling with people struggling to breathe. The very young, the elderly, and those with asthma or bronchitis. By the third day, panic set in. Visibility dropped to less than 1 meter. Ambulances couldn't navigate the streets. People fell into the Thames, disoriented. Drivers crashed into walls and one another, unable to see beyond their headlights. Trains stopped entirely. Funeral homes overflowed with victims. Doctors reported a terrifying pattern. Patients arriving with severe respiratory failure, lips blue, lungs filled with toxic sludge. Animals died in the streets. Farmers near London found their livestock choking in open fields. Even indoors, people weren't safe. The poisonous air seeped through doors and windows, staining wallpaper and curtains with grime. By the time the fog finally lifted on December 9th, the scale of the tragedy was beyond comprehension. More than 4,000 people were dead within days, but later studies suggested the true number may have been closer to 12,000 once delayed respiratory complications were counted. Tens of thousands more were hospitalized or suffered lifelong lung damage. Scientists eventually confirmed what many feared. This wasn't a freak weather event. It was man-made. The endless burning of low-grade sulfur coal for heat, factories belching smoke, and the government's failure to regulate pollution had created the perfect killer. The Great Smog of 1952 became a turning point in environmental awareness. The outrage that followed forced Parliament to act, passing the Clean Air Act of 1956, the first legislation in Britain to control smoke emissions and promote cleaner fuels. Chimneys were redesigned, coal was regulated, and smokeless zones were created. It was the disaster that forced humanity to face an uncomfortable truth: we had poisoned our own sky. In the decades that followed, scientists would look back on those 5 days as the moment when modern environmentalism was born. Not from ideals, but from suffocation. The Great Smog of London wasn't just a tragedy. It was a warning, a reminder that progress without responsibility can turn the very air we breathe into a weapon. Seveso, the chemical cloud, it began like any other summer morning in northern Italy, but by the afternoon of July 10, 1976, the small town of Seveso would become the site of one of Europe's worst chemical disasters.